Ladies and gentlemen, both here with us and those at home who are watching us, Kahal Yakar, our short lecture series deals with Jewish and Christian reception histories of a work that is now 100 years old, Politische Theologie, published in 1922. In 1933, 11 years later, the author of Politische Theologie has joined the Nazi Party. Carl Schmitt became a professor at this university, precisely at the same time that his Jewish colleagues were disenfranchised, ousted from their positions, and murdered. Schmitt himself pushed out his Jewish colleague, Erich Kaufmann, and took his position at the Faculty of Law. Just across the road, in the Bebelplatz, near the law faculty, Schmitt participated in the burning of Jewish books and witnessed the fire consuming the works of his colleagues. If you'd like, you can look at Micha Ullmann's memorial, The Empty Library, on your way home. In light of this history, one may have assumed that there would not be a reception history of Schmitt whatsoever, certainly among Jews, but also among others who wanted to break with Nazism, anti-Semitism, and totalitarianism. One might have expected that Schmitt's attempt to annihilate, to destroy the jüdische Geist would have been met with a similar attempt to annihilate Schmittian heritage. An eye for an eye, as the Hebrew Bible has it. Yet no such break with Schmitt ever occurred, and Schmitts Politische Theologie continued to exert influence after the war and up to the present in forming diverging political discourses which adapted Schmittian ideas to their own ends, often turning Schmitt against himself. Politische Theologie informed critiques of liberalism on both the left and the right, and was even used to defend liberalism. It was partially adopted, partially contested, within critical and post-structural theories, as well as in post-colonial debates and post-secular turns. Schmitt's debated heritage reoccurs in the mapping and remapping of the world to friends and enemies, to clashing civilizations and political allies, prevalent populism, pandemics, and wars also remind us how close Schmitt is to the heart of matters. Our particular interest today and in the next two evenings lie, however, in one specific thread of this reception history, that is, in how Politische Theologie was received among theologians. To put it differently and more accurately, how thinkers who understood themselves as working within their respective traditions interpreted, contrasted, and further developed Schmitt's perception that, and I quote, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. Christian theologians have often identified with Politische Theologie's conviction that theology remains significant for modern politics, even covertly. Schmitt's critique of secularism in this sense was the critique of a convinced Catholic who sought to return theology to its rightful place at the center of modern societies. On the other hand, doubt came to the minds of Christian intellectuals as to whether Politische Theologie was truly a Christian position in the orthodox sense of the word. Did Schmitt, who was, at least officially, no longer a member of the Roman Catholic Church after 1926, not break with key Christian doctrines in a way that was no longer reconcilable with them, distorting theology and opening it as a byproduct to political abuses too? Was Politische Theologie essentially a Christian piece of thought or an anti-Christian one? Similarly, Schmitt's paradigmatic insights on the relationship between the theological and the political were endorsed by Jewish thinkers who sought to understand the complex processes of Jewish secularization. Yet Schmitt's secularized theological concepts were not, after all, Jewish concepts, but Christian ones, whether orthodox or heterodox. Schmitt was therefore a friend of Jewish thinkers to the extent that he helped them think about breaks and continuities in between the Jewish past and the Jewish present, between traditional and modern reasonings. He was, however, an enemy of Jewish thought in two significant ways, as a continuation of the age-old polemic between Judaism and Christianity, and also as an expression of the ever more dangerous modern anti-Semitic attack on Jews, with his active effort to annihilate the jüdische Geist. Politische Theologie, in this sense, may serve as a prism through which to look at the connection between theological anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism, one of the most detrimental expressions of secularization. The Jewish and Christian reception histories of Schmitts political theology are therefore an opportunity to think about breaks and continuities. On the one hand, breaks and continuities between traditional Jewish and Christian reasoning and between secular and political reasoning, and on the other hand, breaks and continuities with regard to Carl Schmitt himself. The 3 evening events which begin today are part of a bigger conference supported by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft and organized by 4 institutions from 3 countries: the Institut Kirche und Judentum at the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, the Katholische Akademie, the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and the Political Theology Network in Philadelphia, each invested in the core questions of political theology in rather different countries and intellectual surroundings. Working on this conference together enabled us, the organizers, to think beyond the specificities of our respective disciplines, political stakes, and local preoccupations, and imagine political theology as a profoundly international discussion. We are delighted to welcome you to this evening event and hope to see you again tomorrow with lectures by Christian Polke and Liora Batnitsky, and on Wednesday with lectures by Vivian Liska and John Milbank. Since our colleague Agata Bielik-Robson unfortunately had to cancel her participation, this evening will be dedicated to a lecture by Professor Christoph Schmidt, Carl Schmitt's Political Theology, and the 2 bodies of the subject. Christoph Schmidt teaches at the Departments of Philosophy, German Literature, and Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University and is a research fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. Christoph's proficiency in the intellectual history of political theology in Jewish, Christian, and modern secular contexts, as evidenced by his many publications on the topic, spans a great variety of periods, currents, and thinkers, from Hermann Cohen to Josef Ratzinger, from Heinrich Heine to René Girard. His book, Die Theopolitische Stunde, provided a pioneering panoramic view on the influence of Weimar radical philosophy and theology on Jewish thinkers, among them Leo Strauss, Isaac Breuer, Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, Jakob Klatschkin, and Ernst Bloch. Christoph's latest book, Israel und die Geister 68er, dealt with the 68 students' movement in Germany and its relation to Jews and the Holocaust. No less importantly, Christoph Schmidt imported politische Theologie into the Israeli discourse. In 2004, he initiated and edited the work's translation into Hebrew, the first, and to this date, the only publication of Carl Schmitt in the Hebrew language. He is very much responsible for the familiarization of the term politische Theologie, Theologia Politit, in Israel, especially through 2 research groups he organized at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and is an editor of the proceedings of their work. Especially noteworthy are the 2 volumes, God Will Not Remain Silent, Jewish Modernity and Political Theology, and State of Exception and State of Emergency, both published in 2009. With this immense scholarly work, Christoph has provided crucial tools for Israeli as well as Palestinian scholars whose work environment is, from the outset, one of the most politically and theologically charged places in the world. We are looking forward to your lecture, dear Christoph, and to the discussion with the audience that will follow. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Thank you very much to the Humboldt University, to the Catholic Academy, and of course to my friends from the Van Leer Institute. I won't speak very much about Jewish receptions, although I have a very interesting Jewish recipient who will somehow scandalize the scene. And I will speak about Carl Schmitt and his political theology, about a text that we all know that Schmitt was very critical about the aesthetical He looked at it very critical, he fought against it, he dismissed with it. It was for him the sphere of the undetermined, the undecided, the romanticism, worse even, discussion. But at the same time, if one looks at the concept of the exception, which he tried somehow to give a theological background, it shows very much affinity to the aesthetical exception. Think of the definition of Schmitt as the sovereign who decides about the exceptional state, and compare it with what Arnold Schoenberg, Wassily Kandinsky, and Hugo Ball and other artists are doing around 1910, 1915. That's precisely what they do. They get up and they cancel their constitutions in the name of their sovereign aesthetic expression. So my question will be, how does Schmitt cope with this affinity to the aesthetical? How is it there? How does it become prominent? How does it at the end become dominant? And here, when I follow up this undecidedness of the exception between theology and aesthetics, I arrive at an interesting meeting that Carl Schmitt held, at least as a fictional meeting, with another Schmitt, with Caspar Schmitt. And Caspar Schmitt is the guy you see on the right hand there, is Max Stirner, the philosopher of radical asceticism, if you want, nihilism of the ego. And my question will be, what is the relation between these two Schmitts? Caspar Schmitt and Carl Schmitt, whom Schmitt evokes in a scene when he is in American custody as a criminal of war. He describes a meeting with Caspar Schmitt. And I want to pick up from this. This is written in the Ex Captivitate de Salus, his text in the captivity. And from there, I want to do something quite crazy and try to sort of reconstruct a kind of dialectics between theology and secularity, or even better, between political eschatology as we know it in modernity and the kind of logic of exception which is developing in radical asceticism, and ask where Schmitt is really located there. Okay, this will be my mission here, and I will accompany it with pictures. What you see here is, of course, Schmitt, and then in the middle somebody recognizes this is Hugo Ball, the Dadaist, who made his first appearance in the Cabaret Voltaire in the costume of a bishop, reading radical Dada poetry. Okay? And to the right, you see Max Stirner, portrait, by the way, by Friedrich Engels, he painted him in a meeting here in the Friedrichstraße in Hippels Weinstube. Okay, so here we are. Carl Schmitt's theory of the absolute state of exception defines this concept as a broader concept of the extreme sphere, which transcends the possibility of a legal definition. Schmitt, the self-appointed katechon, wants to ground this concept through the analogy between theology and politics in order to stop the modern secular eschatologies of humanism, liberalism, socialism now. In spite of this explicit orientation in theology, Schmitt could not fully hide the affinity of this state of exception and its sovereign subject with modern avant-garde aesthetics. The political sovereign, whose decision stems from the exceptional state, looked all too similar to the aesthetic genius who, in the name of the undefinable aesthetical appearance, the unsayable, would suspend the traditional order of art around 1910 in a gesture of sovereign expression. I already mentioned, think of Kandinsky, Schoenberg, and Hugo Ball. You see them all there. Hugo Ball, by the way, being a very good friend at the time of Carl Schmitt. In this sense, a composer like Ferruccio Busoni, who's on the right, hoped for, and I quote, the execution of an art where every case would be a new one, an exception. Creation, he wrote, means to create from nothing, as the task of the creator consists in setting up rules, not in following them. Indeed, Schmidt's project seems to move alongside this internal border between theology and aesthetics, which against his own pathos of decision indicates so many other ambivalences of his political theology. And it was Hugo Ball, again you see him as the third picture there, who sought at the time to overcome the absolute exceptional state of his art by the transformation of his Dada poems into mystical divine names of God, and who pointed to this problem in his critique of Carl Schmitt's Political Theology from 1924. It's probably one of the first written on political theology. In spite of Schmitt's Roman Catholicism as a political form from 1923, he suspected a hidden relation between theology and aesthetics in his writings, which would lead to a final negation of theology. And I quote from Hugo Ball, when Schmitt exposed himself as the deadly enemy of romantic aesthetics, he indeed fought against his own creative fundaments. End of quote. So with this danger of a return of the suppressed aesthetics, Schmitt's state of exception involves always already decision against this tendency, so that either theology or aesthetics becomes the figure of the enemy as the figure of his own question. You know, this game of Schmitt with the enemy is his figure of his own question. So we shall see how much indeed the concept of enmity, which becomes explicit, of course, only in the concept of the political from 1927, is connected to the emancipation of the aesthetical from all rule in Schmitt's thought. Already at the end of the first chapter of Political Theology, Schmitt, without spelling out his name, summons a Protestant theologian as witness for his theory of exception. No. It's, of course, Søren Kierkegaard. And I quote from Schmidt's quotation. The exception explains the universal. Part of the quotation is up there. The exception explains the universal and itself. If one wants to study the universal correctly, one has only to explore the real exception. The exception will clarify everything in a much better way. In the long run, one becomes tired of the eternal talk about the universal. There are exceptions. If one cannot explain them, one cannot explain the universal. So if you read now Schmidt's quotation in its original form in Søren Kierkegaard's text, coming from the repetition, it proves to be a textual installation of some kind which embezzles the deduction of the exception in Kierkegaard's text, not from theology, but from the existence of the poet. This implicit or hidden difference between theology and aesthetics accompanies Schmidt's theory since his critique of political romanticism, political theology, and culminates, of course, in his definition of the Führer as the personal incarnation of the exceptional state and state movement people from 1934. Here, the aesthetical finally overshadows all theological intention, or rather appears in a very strange mixture. Schmitt plays with the autonomous aesthetics here, aesthetics of beauty and the sublime, when he tries to adjust the intuition to the concept, or the concept to the intuition of the Führer, leaving all traditional concepts such as the shepherd, the doctor, or the captain behind him. The definition amounts to a staging of an absolute aesthetical revelation of the Führer as real presence. The final overcoming of the distance between concept and intuition in the personal presence of the Führer symbolizes, in fact, a kind of eschatological fulfillment of his political theology, the concrete incarnation of the idea of exception in the historical personal presence. And I quote from Schmidt's effort to define what the Führer is all about. None of these pictures, you will see immediately where this connects to the quotation on the board. None of these pictures can essentially hit what we understand under the German meaning of political guidance. This concept originates in the concrete and substantial thought of the National Socialist movement. It is characteristic that any picture fails. Our concept does neither need nor is it capable of any mediating picture or analogy. It is the concept of an immediate and real presence. But here we become witness of an additional explication of the nature of this full aesthetic presence of the sovereign as a positive demand, the unconditional racial equality between Führer and Gefolgschaft. The aesthetic presence is supposed to involve this ultimate incarnation in the unity of Führer and Volk. The Führer as the presence of the full racial unity of the two bodies of leader and people appears as a secularized form of the traditional dogmatic definition of the unity of the divine and mortal body in Christ, as the sovereign turns, of course, in this power of unity against his eschatological enemy. By the way, the underline of this book is die Dreigliederung der politischen Einheit, the three elements of the one unity of the political, which is clearly a Trinitarian metaphor of some kind. Apparently, the ascetical has overcome the theological, while at the same time they merge in a monstrous identity, a conversion between the pure ascetical existence and the secularized Christology as racial union. Now, it will be interesting to follow the echo of these ambivalences and conversions in Schmidt's reflections about his own intellectual biography, which he has written down publicly for the first time as American prisoner of war under the title Ex Captivitate Salus. Apparently, this title indicates a return of some kind to theology due to Schmidt's exceptional situation, of course, seeing himself now as a victim and tormented prisoner of history, and who turns now, I quote, to the prayer to the crucified God as his last asylum, and so on and so on. But the further reflections on his present existence are obviously preparing another salvation made possible through a radical aesthetics of existence, avoiding any theological reflection, certainly a fraction on responsibility, guilt, or repentance. Who are you? Quis est tu? This is a question of the abyss I plunged deep into in June 1945. Schmitt asks in one of his reflections in Ex Captivitate Salus, and goes on, my essence may not be transparent, but my case can be named maybe with the help of a name which a great poet has found. It is the bad, unworthy case of a Christian Epimetheus. However, we want to understand this case of a Christian Epimetheus who adds to the strategy of darkening the access to his own case by the mythological enigma. As Epimetheus, Schmitt turns into the very hero who cannot decide, and with his marriage to Pandora opens her famous box with all the divine punishments for his brother's treason. This is Prometheus. Is this figure a hidden confession that his political theology has turned into an ultimate danger since he has turned his back on theology? Anyhow, the definition comes from a poet and points to an ascetical case, a mythology, and glorifies himself as, of course, an innocent victim of a tragedy. As a victim caught up in the waves of history, persecuted by the Nazis and by the Americans, it is not by chance that Schmitt finds ultimate comfort in a fictional visit in his cell at night. Wants to hide. So this is Ex Captivitate Salus. Carl Schmitt meets the philosopher of sovereign existence and aesthetic nihilism, the radical anti-theologian Max Stirner, whose original name was Caspar Schmitt. Caspar Schmitt affirms here the aesthetical enigma of Carl Schmitt's enigmatic being. He knows that the ego is no object of thinking, that the ego is an unsayable being beyond essence, definition, and even the moral law, that it is pure ego, egoist, and will to power beyond good and evil. At first glance, Schmitt keeps his academic distance from Max Stirner, his double, to whom he attests that it was him who prepared him for the depths of European history as the scene of self-destruction of German theology and idealist philosophy. Yeah, so that is the night at the cell. I'm heading to the definition here, which Schmitt adds to his observation on Stirner. What explodes today was prepared before 1848. The fire that burns today was laid then. Without drawing any connection between the fire laid by Stirner and his own role in setting the fire in 1922, Schmitt recognizes behind the figure of Stirner the prehistory and Urgeschichte of some sort of the modern secularization process, which would lead from Hegel to Feuerbach to Marx, one could add Bruno Bauer, Arno Droge and others, to Max Stirner. This process unfolded in post-Hegelian critique of religion and utopian politics, leading from Hegel via Feuerbach and Marx, and Stirner's anarchist attacks on all theology and its humanist surrogates. Without mentioning the predecessors of his political eschatology here, Schmitt points to Stirner as its final actor, who turned this modern political eschatology onto its head and became its most radical anti-theologian when he drew the last consequences from this aesthetic existence for a politics beyond law, morality, and humanity, the paradigm of the ultimate crime. Schmitt records Stirner's fantasies. It doesn't. No. No, it doesn't work here. I'm sorry. I'm in picture 8, if you can help me. Yeah, here we are. Thank you. Schmitt records Stirner's fantasies of the paradise of a perfect innocence, which is, of course, nothing but the other internal side of criminal action, and enters the garden of a perfect being and life of redemption from God and sin, the refuge and salvation for his captivity in the historical circumstances. And Schmitt writes, this is the new paradise. This is the nature of the right of nature, the suspension of self-alienation in a life of the body without problems, the Adamitic happiness of the garden of desires. And of course, Schmitt remains outside as a critical academic distance. This paradise of perfect innocence, nevertheless, is the ultimate expression of his aesthetics of this specific being beyond concept and explanation, the salvation from his historical captivity. In this paradise, he can pass through with the question, who am I? Hide in a perfect enigmatic existence and develop sophisticated reflections on the origins of the catastrophe. But he does not have to answer only the moral, the existential, theological, the Adamitic question, where are you? God's question to Adam after his sin in paradise. Ex captivitate salus draws salvation then as an aesthetic way out, a flight from theology through the aesthetics of existence beyond guilt and repentance. It is an existential repetition of Schmitt's movement from theology to aesthetics in his political theological career, which culminates in Stirner's radical aesthetics as a model for the being beyond concept of the Führer. This movement corresponds thus with the prehistorical landscape of the field of self-destruction of theology and philosophical idealism after Hegel. Is Schmitts political theology at the end only a kind of ontogenetic repetition of the phylogenetic development of post-Hegelian discourse of political theology? Is it at the end just an effect or epiphenomenon of the very dialectics of theology and secularity unfolding in this eschatology, without that Schmitt reflects on its meaning, but rather adopts its catastrophic results, elaborates on them, and develops his concepts from Stirner as the last eschatologian? Taking the lead now from the climax of Schmitt's movement, namely in his definition of the concept of the Führer as identity of the absolute aesthetical subject and the pseudo-Christology of the two bodies of Führer and Volk, I want to offer a very short history of this post-Hegelian eschatology in order to locate Schmitt's political aesthetics in its concrete position. I want to describe this prehistory not only as the transformation from theology to aesthetics, but more specifically as the transformation from the Christology of the two bodies of Christ into the unity of the two bodies of the subject as man and mankind in post-Hegelian philosophy. And with this short sketch, I think you do it better. Number 9. Yeah, here we are. With this short sketch, I adopt an esoteric reading instruction from Ernst Kantorowicz, namely his book, The King's Two Bodies from 1957, where this German Jewish author adopted the concept of political theology in order to describe the ideological fundament of medieval monarchy. It's an interesting border case now to speak about Jewish reception. Of course he was Jewish. This radical right wing, part of the Free Cause, shooting at socialists in Berlin, was part of the Stefan George circle. And his book doesn't deal with Jewish questions, but with Christology and monarchy in the medieval times. So, but still, maybe it's Jewish reception. Kantorowicz does not only describe the complex legal implications of the analogy between the two bodies of Christ, the divine and mortal body, and the king's two bodies, mortal and ideal, but he indulges in its numerous iconographies, among which he mentions the one of the king's two crowns. In Latin, the corona visibilis and the corona invisibilis as symbols for the king's two bodies. In fact, he unfolds a fascinating drama when the analogy between the unity of the two bodies derived from Christ enters a radical crisis in the 16th and 17th century, and the mortal king turns against his ideal political form, like in certain tragedies from Shakespeare. That's the reason why Shakespeare appears in the middle between these two pictures of the book. So that, and I quote Kantorowicz, the king in his natural body becomes a traitor of his political and high body. The self-accusation of Richard II in Shakespeare's famous tragedy sounds like an anticipation of the accusation of high treason against Charles I in the English Revolution. Now, could it be that Kantorowicz wanted to point with this drama to its modern analogy and explain its specific catastrophe? Here, we do not only witness a process of transformation from Christology to the two bodies of the subject, from the divine and mortal body of Christ to the two bodies of the subject as individual and universal, man and mankind. In post-Hegelian political theology, here we have three other radical Hegelians from Hippel's Weinstube. But we face a similar drama of transformation from the utopian unity of the subject to a radical antithesis between the two bodies, so that Christology turns at the end into a scene of absolute difference and enmity. Different from the medieval case, though, this transformation unfolds as a dialectics between Christology and secular subjectivity when it is based on a radical critique of religion, which reduces theology to an utopian and finally aesthetic anthropology. So let us have a very short look at this scene of self-destruction of theology and its eschatologic leading to the aesthetic logic of exception. It was David Friedrich Strauss, here on the left side, who in his Life of Jesus from 1835 translated Hegel's philosophy of the absolute spirit into a humanist Christianity, when he transformed the personal unity of the divine and human body of Christ into the unity of an eschatological unity of man and mankind in an ideal society of freedom. This transformation of Christology into the two bodies of the subject became the paradigm and model for the various projects of the young Hegelians, radicalizing both critique of religion and the utopian translation. So in this line, Ludwig Feuerbach wanted to expel the last traces of Hegel's theological spirit as a ghost and liberate the whole and true man in his unity of man and mankind. Christology was just a projection of this original form of the subject's love reflected in a perfect dialogical communication. And Marx, Engels, Bakunin would repeat now Feuerbach's strategy when they accused him of hidden theological remnants and demanded a full historical secularization. In Marx's words, man makes religion, religion does not create man, who has not grasped himself yet or has lost himself again. And when Marx and Engels pointed to the concrete human existence in the history of class struggles against Feuerbach's utopian unity, they still adopted it as the ideal form of humanity in the final stage of history to be realized in the revolutionary action under the direction of the party. In strict consequence of this eschatologic, Bakunin's radical anarchism opposed Marx and Engels' Communist Manifest as another form of theology, that is, of domination and power to be finally overcome with the whole of monotheism and its bourgeois liberal and socialist surrogates in immediate terrorist action against all state institutions. Now, when all these political utopias adopt the Christological idea of a unity of the two bodies of the subject, as a unity of man and mankind, as the model of a perfect society, it was Max Stirner, who in his radical anarchist manifest on the ego and its possession from 1844, initiated a last attack on all of these eschatological forms of politics as theologies. It does not make any difference, he claimed, whether the individual existence of man submitted to God and his law, or to the law of humanity, in liberalism, socialism, or communism. In all these cases, the individual aesthetical self finds itself formatted by a general essence and a moral concept, eliminating its individual being. Liberalism, socialism, communism were nothing but hidden forms of an internalized theology, its last ghosts and specters who prevented the full liberty of man. When this liberty could only unfold as full sovereign power beyond good and evil, it figured as the last radical consequence of the young Hegelians' critique of religion and their eschatological politics of freedom. Man would have to turn against mankind and humanity. The unity of the two bodies would now split into an antithesis and enmity between the two bodies. Do you help me? Yes. Now I give the whole quotation from the opening of Stirner's chapter on the ego. At the entrance of the modern age stands the God-man. As its exit will only God and the God-man evaporate? And can the God-man really die if only the God dies in him? They did not think of this question and thought they were through when in our day they brought to a victorious end the work of the Enlightenment, the vanquishing of God. They did not notice that man has killed God in order to become now the whole God on high. The world outside of us is indeed brushed away, and the great undertaking of the Enlightenment completed. But the other world in us has become a new haven and calls us for a renewed heavening storm. God has had to give place, yet not to us, but to man. Now, how can you believe that the God-man is dead before the man in him besides the God is dead? With the birth of the pure ascetical self, beyond good and evil, who sanctifies the ultimate crime, Stirner celebrated the Roman Emperor Nero and the sin against the Holy Spirit as the final agents of the eschatology of liberation through a total enmity against theology, humanism, and its variations in liberalism and socialism. But when he cynically defined this radical antinomianism as a sin against the Holy Spirit, he indicated his own fundamental paradox. The pure aesthetical self beyond all essence and concept, the pure infinity beyond totality, was just a new incarnation of a new divine being. possibly the devil, who claimed the place of God for himself. It could only liberate itself from sin by performing it and becoming God, or of course a fake God. Next picture. Thanks. This is the end of Stirner's book, referring to the question of the relation between the liberated self and God. This is what Stirner says. They say of God, name thee not. That holds good for me. No concept expresses me. Nothing that is designated as my essence exhausts me. They are only names. Likewise, they say of God that he is perfect and has no calling to strive after perfection. That too holds good of me alone. Now, behind these scenes and forms of eschatological political theology, we can recognize the very process of the self-destruction of theology, as does Schmitt in Ex Captivitate Salus. But the closer view exposes this process as the very dialectical mechanism between theology and secular politics, between the critique of religion and the utopian politics of the subject, which leads to the inversion of theology via radical ethical utopia into radical asceticism of the sovereign subject, who declares his enmity against theology and its surrogates. In this sense, Schmidt's hidden or implicit movement from theology or aesthetics appears as an effect, or epiphenomenon of this eschatologic and dialectics, which does not reflect on this dialectics and the possible critical role of theology at all. Instead, he submits to the last aesthetical consequences of this political eschatology in Stirner's absolute single as the final scene of theological self-destruction in order to give this final version a last eschatological twist, identifying now the aesthetic self with the pseudo-Christological unity of Führer and Volk. So when Stirner's absolute aesthetic self has detached itself from mankind and its rules, Schmitt has identified this absolute self with the Führer in order to create a new eschatological form of the two bodies of the subject on dictatorial and racial terms. This scene becomes the scene of the absolute state of exception, since it opposes the eschatologies of liberation of the absolute individual self against the absolute liberation of mankind. These opposed political theologies have transformed the God-man into two competing secular eschatologies, the eschatology of the sovereign and of mankind, which have to be at war with each other. So this is the birth of the concept of the political as the concept of the enemy. And when modernity has turned from a utopian landscape into a permanent scene of self-destruction, Schmitt translates this turn now with Thomas Hobbes into its new underlying natural state. Instead of the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century, Schmitt replaces the ideological or eschatological wars between radical left and right as the natural state of modernity, extending finally on global scale. Schmitt deciphers the catastrophic movement of self-destruction in modern history through the development of these various conceptualizations, very much like a fascinated spectator. Maybe the Epimetheus, okay, who watches the war between the eschatological forces on the way to destroy each other finally, taking a strange aesthetical, if not cynical, enjoyment in this destruction. Against this pathos of decision, he becomes the Christian Epimetheus, the supposed katechon, who decided to put an end to eschatology, but could only intensify its violent logic as another eschatologian on the way to final destruction. So the political theologian is always already the enemy of himself, the enemy as his own question. Instead of becoming a theologian, he lost himself in the eschatology of the ascetic subject, finding himself caught in the eschatological captivity of the sovereign subject, postponing all salvation. It comes to my mind that this kind of perspective, to look at things with this cynical kind of attitude, comes very close to his description of the Jewish enemy in the Leviathan. He accuses Jews of being just observers who enjoy the war between the peoples as part of their messianic liberation. But there is some affinity between these two attitudes, okay? Schmitt and the enemy as his own question. But is there a salvation to this captivity? Ex captivitate salus. Can there be a salvation when the danger of the captivity constantly increases? Is there a liberation from absolute eschatological liberation? In this case, the political theologian who has turned his back on classical Catholic theology would have to look behind the landscape of self-destruction and the debris of history and reread the theological mechanism behind modern eschatology and aesthetic secularization. This would mean that the political theologian takes the modern critique of religion one step further, beyond the logic of the eschaton as aesthetical subject and its reduction. You help me? Is there a salvation from captivity? So this is precisely what two other young Hegelians intended to do. Namely, Søren Kierkegaard, of whom we heard and whom Schmitt admired as a vital theologian, of course never followed him, and Heinrich Heine, whom he has set on his list of the Jewish enemies, who are supposed to subvert Hobbes' secular Leviathan. By the way, most of the analogies that Schmitt uses, the famous analogies, theism, deism, pantheism, atheism, as analogies to monarchy, constitutional monarchy, democracy, and so on, are all nearly stemming from Heinrich Heine's text on religion and philosophy in Germany from 1834. So Bakunin picked them up from Heine and Schmitt and so on. Although quite different in their intellectual disposition, Kierkegaard and Heine have much more in common as poet-philosophers who have found their belief in the personal God and a new form of dialogue between theology and philosophy on the basis of existential freedom. Both have defined their life as an aesthetic exception, an infinity of some sort of being, of possibilities, of course, beyond conceptual or moral totality. But both were aware of the existential danger and seduction for the self to turn its finite freedom with its open possibilities into an absolute form of power, the way Stirner did. Both diagnosed here a fundamental anxiety of the aesthetical self from the insecurities of finite freedom, fleeing from itself and seeking for absolute security. Both identified Hegel's absolute idealism with this fundamental anxiety of the self to accept its finite conditions. And from the perspective of this fundamental existential experience of concrete freedom and its anxiety, both have deciphered the underlying mechanism of modern political eschatology, the dialectics of theology and secularity, with the theological concept of sin, which nearly no theologian would dare today to do. In order to do what? To point to the two central effects of this hidden will of man to become absolute or a kind of fake God. The elimination of God is nothing but the first step to the absolute empowerment of the subject as God or fake God. And this empowered self as a proto-divine being projects his or her own sin then as a consequence onto the other, the enemy. He becomes the enemy, the ultimate enemy, who avoids his or her eschatological self-realization. Both have described this modern drama with the Daniel apocalypse of King Nebuchadnezzar as a kind of metonymy of modern subjectivity, which they identified with Hegel's philosophy. Yeah, the mechanism of sin, Nebuchadnezzar, the book of sin, and you can even go one further. And I quote now from Heine's famous confession in the second introduction to his history of religion, philosophy, and Germany. And here's the quote. How often since those days have I thought of the Babylonian king who esteemed as no less than God, but who, having miserably fallen from the summit of his infatuation, crawled like an animal on the ground eating grass. This story is to be found in the grandiose and splendid book of Daniel, a story which I recommend to the edifying contemplation of my stubborn friend Marx and to my unregenerate friends, these godless self-gods, Feuerbach, Daumer, Bruno Bauer, and whatever are their names. With the concept of sin, both reminded, first of all, negatively, of what Kierkegaard called the infinite difference between man and God, in order to characterize the modern eschatology of the subject as the work of a fundamental existential and political idolatry built on an absolute theory of identity. But when both turned to belief in the personal God beyond the philosophical system as against the modern sin of self-empowerment, they turned as well against the other sin, the sin of submission of man under God the Lord and its effects of political submission, so typical for the ideologists of monarchist restoration, of the counter-enlightenment. Both sins of modernity, the self-empowerment over the other and the self-submission under the other, were only the two complementary sides of the same sin against the true idea of freedom, and thus against the true God who revealed himself to man as the God of freedom against man's claim to absolute power. Thus both wanted to liberate freedom from its totalitarian dangers and political instrumentalizations in eschatology. They demanded a second enlightenment or a second exit from self-inflicted immaturity as the liberation from radical eschatological liberation and its logic of exception. This enlightenment would liberate then both God and man, theology and philosophy, belief and knowledge from the eschatological systems of their absolute identity for a new relation, correlation, or covenant between the aesthetical self and the personal God as the condition for a society of freedom beyond totalitarianism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Christoph, for this very, very rich presentation and lecture. And we have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion with you. So if there is anybody that is interested in starting, I can come with a microphone to you. Can you wave your hand up high? Are you sure? We say in Hebrew, לא כולם ביחד, not all together. So, oh, Menachem.
Thank you so much, Christoph. It's really, I think about your own journey with Carl Schmitt over the past 40 years. It's remarkable to see you stand up here and give this lecture here at Humboldt. I think that one of the things, at least for me, your talk illuminates is the return of the temporal element, which it seems to me, at least, that at least in some of his writing, Carl Schmitt wants to remain much more Kantian and downplay that element. Would you say that that's really part of the movement of the disenchantment with the Third Reich? That's part of what happens is the eschatological growth in his own story. I'm thinking also about Bultmann's lectures in Scotland in the 1950s on eschatology and history. How it's sort of the entrance and the exit of the temporal from this kind of political thinking. I would love to hear some more about that.
Well, maybe you know that the line that I drew right now was really Schmitt against the grain, in a sense. And let us look at this aesthetical moment. But it turns out not just to be an aesthetical moment, a radical aesthetical moment. You know? We tend to think about aesthetics as the nice thing, the harmless thing, the negative, the unsayable, the beyond, and whatever. I mean, take any text of Levinas. It's like it's the infinity. But who promised us that this infinity is a nice one? And I think this is one of the basic intuitions that Schmitt actually learns from the aesthetical writings of Kierkegaard, by the way. But my sort of intention by reading it this way was not only to see this aesthetical moment as a decisive one here, but to see this as sort of the final stage of eschatology. All eschatology will at the end lead to the moment where there is a self claiming his power. And if you read the way that he for instance, criticizes Bakunin, he says, well, Bakunin, that's a nice case, but you know, you are not aware of the fact that you will need power in order to get what you call a powerless state. And I think he is stuck at that moment. He is not really getting towards a reflection on what does really theology mean. Whether you take his theoretical text and whether you take these personal texts, you see he's blind for the real theological issue. It belongs to the past. It belongs, I don't know, to a kind of convention he is probably still even following up. Maybe he went to church even on Sunday, but it's not something that becomes real. So I don't think that he ever made a serious advance to see himself as part of modern political eschatology and as really its worst part. Yeah? And I think his sort of following Hitler then was not an accident. That was really on the line. That was really on the line. I mean, all these texts, whatever you do with them at the end, if you read the very passage I brought here from Staat, Bewegung, Volk, where he describes the Führer as the pure presence, the appearance of the real. I mean, you know, this is really like even in terms of phenomenology, it's the fulfillment of the intention, of his writing intention. So I don't know whether I got your question sort of correctly, but I don't think there was a critical reflection on this joining Nazi eschatology. I don't believe so. Okay?
Thank you very much, Christoph. If I understand it correctly, you say that ultimately there is no meaning to the entire catechonic politics. So the catechon and the parousia are basically the same thing.
The catechon and eschatologian are the same. I mean, think about this debate in Agamben, where he tries to sort of create these two categories as the present constitution of enmity. You really read yourself into this, you will see his catechon is the eschatologian, the eschatologian is the catechon. So you get really, this is an empty game. And I think you can really see this in Schmitt's point. But sorry, I interrupted.
No, so I just wanted to know if you think this is a problem in Schmitt, or is this in general with the entire concept of the catechon?
The question is, who is the catechon? Who is the catechon? And what is the theological or political legitimation of it? I think it will be at the end pretty different if you read St. Augustine on what he thinks that the catechon is, or if you take medieval texts on what they think on politics and the catechon, and what Schmitt thinks that the catechon is. If he wants the Führer to be the catechon, this is total, it really doesn't fit, absolutely not. Because this is the realization of an ultimate eschatology. It's the ultimate eschatology of race, which says until we haven't eliminated the enemy race, we can't get to redemption. So this is a whole eschatology, a real political eschatology in in the worst of traditions of your Chitic historical eschatology. The worst of them, the absolutely worst. Of course he has an eschatology. And then, of course, he regrets. I'm Epimetheus. I was only looking at that. I'm a Christian. All these games, they're so... at least once you get the picture of that kind of cynicism or nihilism, then all these games, they look so... Well, they really look bad. I'm an Epimetheus. It's better than the catechol, of course.
Thank you very much for this brilliant tour de force, so to say. I have a question. In the glossarium, there are some notes on Kierkegaard, where I think he realizes a little bit that he should turn. When he quotes, for instance, this passage where Kierkegaard says, we are in an age where generals and Jesuits don't play a role at all. The only role that can be played today is a martyr. So in that quote, you see he comes close to what you pointed out, but ultimately he was not really able to to fully endorse that. And the second thing I would underline what you said, that the road to Hitler was clearly on the way before Hitler. And for me, the most interesting and most often overlooked book is his theory of the Constitution, where he drops and omits Romans 13. He says Romans 13 doesn't play a role. We have to join Mazzini. And Mazzini is probably also a political part of the aesthetics you described, because Mazzini has some kind of a pantheistic understanding of democracy, and he endorsed it completely. So what you showed with people, leader people movement with the book is also already in the theory of constitution, although people don't read the theory of the Constitution as the road towards Hitler, but I'm very sure that it is.
No, thank you very much for both remarks. I mean, I can only learn from you and look up in glossarium, and since it's a kind of affirmation, more or less, of what I'm trying to say, so I'm happy that you found a good quotation for it. I'm looking it up, and the theory of the Constitution is probably his most important book and the one that nobody reads. And here is a good advice. Let's read the book and see how it works there. By the way, it was Mussolini, who was one of his heroes in the situation of the present parliamentary system, who said about Stirner that he is the great artist who explained to us how man can become God again. And this is one of the heroes of his 1926 book on the political myth. So with all the, I mean, he had this kind of strategy. When he is close to something, he could take a cool distance and look at this and give a brilliant analysis. It's the same, by the way, if you really look what he says on Stirner and Ex Captivitate Salus, you can think, he is giving a good analysis. But at the same time, if you think about the whole logic, then you see, well, this is the way that he gets very close to the text by keeping a distance. And I think here the reader is always fooled. It's always fooled, because this is his reading. When he is closest, he can get a kind of distance, say, well, that's the way it works, and so on, and develop a brilliant analysis, okay, that kind of thing. But thank you very much for both remarks.
If nobody asks, I'll show. You laid out this fascinating connection between the two bodies of the subject, the unrestrained subject, the personal subject, which ends up with a sort of a personal eschatology, and the political eschatology as the second body of the king, which ends up with another catastrophe, a political one. And I wonder, which kind of an alternative theory of the subject, because, you know, originally when I saw the title, I thought that you are going to tell us about two ways to perceive the subject, and you did the opposite. You said that these two sides are the same thing. And I wonder which kind of an alternative you imagine to this unrestrained ego that would not end up with a political eschatology. So which kind of a theory of subjectivity you wish to develop?
Well, I tried to raise this at the end when I asked, is there a salvation to that? And I quoted these two astonishingly very close thinkers, Heine and Kierkegaard. It's incredible how close they are. It's really incredible, and there's nearly no text about this affinity between these two writers. What they really said, and well, it's taboo, it is unpleasant, it's unheard of. They say, well, what we deal with is sin. But not just sin in the classical Orthodox sin, I have done something bad in front of God. No, in the new sense, and here they are post-Hegelians, in the sense that they have done harm to their freedom. The whole point of calling the sin in Kierkegaard and in Heidegger is to say what all these politicians are doing when they speak freedom, they are harming their own freedom, because either they suppress somebody at the end, or they get caught in their own vision of an absolute self. So this is a basic sin, and this would be true for the two selves, for the absolute self against humanity, and for that kind of this utopian idea of a unified subject for Marx, Feuerbach, and all these people. They are sinners, but sinners not just in the simple religious Catholic Orthodox sin, but I think in the original meaning of sin. That sin is only possible on the basis of the gift of God to man as freedom. And the whole thing about sin is that man couldn't really live up to his freedom. Freedom would then mean that it is not only the relation between man and woman, man and man, and so on. It would always presuppose the absolute that is beyond our finity. Well, that's very theological. I don't know. I'm not so sure whether I expressed it in the right terms. But the whole point is that Heine and Kierkegaard used this concept of sin in order to say, look at this. You know, in a sense, you had it in Stirner's final admission of ego and his possession, when he said, well, what's the difference between God and me? Now I'm God. Okay? So they said, yeah, that's precisely your problem, because now you will be caught up in yourself. Try to be an absolute self. I mean, I don't know whether you're familiar with these wonderful passages in Kierkegaard's Either Or, where he describes the problem of Nero. Why Nero, who has all the freedom and all the possibilities and powers to do what he wants, is not able to perform. He is caught in his freedom, okay? And the great thing about, I think, about Kierkegaard and Heine in this case, I think overlooked in many senses because they belong together. Kierkegaard is more existential, Heine is more political, have really sensed here is the problem of our modernity. Precisely here. What do we do with the vulnerability of our individual selves and our freedom, and how do we translate this in a politics which, when accepted as such, can never sort of become totalitarian? Okay, that was their kind of remedy. It is actually incredible how careful theologians are. Since the beginning of the 20th, maybe Karl Barth still would be able to speak about the problem of sin, but theologians are so afraid of the secular public to use the word, while Heine and Kierkegaard were very clear about that, and had a wonderful, clear analysis of its existential and its political implications. But thank you very much for your question. תודה רבה.